Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this year's Annual Pride Debate hosted by the NXF and Dublin Pride. Last year, at our virtual debate, we didn't think that we'd be in the same place this year. And in many ways, our outlook is more optimistic than it was this time last year. And in many other ways, our community has suffered disproportionately. Our battles still go on. And we're going to explore this evening a lot of those battle areas with our panellists. I would like to thank our panellists for joining us this evening on behalf of the NXF. And we really look forward to hearing your insights on the LGBTI strategy for government, parenting rights, trans healthcare, and upcoming legislation. In the NXF, we've had a busy year. GCN and the GCN team have done an amazing job of bringing our community together, running the In and Out Festival, online events, increasing their online presence. We reduced our print schedule of GCN, but I'm really happy to say that just last week the Pride edition has been printed and is available for you to pick up, so please get your copy. In the NXF, we are also involved in a number of research projects, starting with partnering on the effects of lockdown on the LGBTQ+ community. We have 2 ongoing research projects that will be published in the second half of the year. We're also proud to announce that we will be publishing our first annual report this year. And the last piece of news that I want to share with you is that we are expanding the NXF board, and we have recruited some really amazing new board members. I'll be stepping down as chairperson, and we'll soon announce a new board of amazing community activists. I want to finish by thanking you for your support of GCN and the NXF ongoing, and especially over the past year. Thank you again to our panellists for joining us tonight and for giving us their insights on our community and the issues that impact us. Thank you to Adam for organising and hosting the debate, and to Dublin Pride for partnering with us. Wishing you a very happy Pride.
Now, thank you, Caroline. Thank you for that, Caroline. And we also want to wish you, on behalf of the board of the National LGBT Federation, all the best in your future endeavours, and thank you for your commitment over the past 5 years. I want to welcome our viewers to this. It's now one of the, I suppose, flagship events of the Pride festivities, and this year is no different. So I'm going to introduce the panellists. We have Senator Annie Hoey of the Labour Party, and Annie is a member herself of our LGBT+ community. She was a councillor in 2019 and then became a senator in 2020. And you're very welcome to the debate, Annie.
Thanks for having me.
We have the Minister for Equality, Diversity, Integration and Disability. Is that correct? And
children, equality, disability, integration and youth.
You have quite a big department, Roderick. So. But of course, we will be concentrating on the equality aspect of your brief this evening. And Roderick as well is a member of our LGBT+ community, has been in politics, I think, since the early 2000s. 2004 you were a councillor, and then you got elected to the Dáil in 2020, and you became a minister. So that's a great honour for the community, it's a great honour for yourself, and we're very pleased to have you here with us this evening. And then we're also joined by our remote panellists. We have from both the Europe and from Northern Ireland. We have the Vice President of the European Parliamentary LGBTI Intergroup, and that's Lisa Schumacher, and she's an MEP with the Renew Europe group. And we're also joined from Northern Ireland by Andrew Muir, MLA, and Andrew is as well part of the LGBT+ community and is doing really amazing work. He's a member of the Alliance Party, he's their spokesperson for finance, and he's very prominent on LGBT+ issues also. So without further ado, we're going to get into the debate, and we're going to start actually with what's happening at a European level. And of course, everyone will be aware of the real concern of events in Hungary and Poland, particularly Hungary, I think, with the passage of a very draconian law based on the Russian propaganda law, I suppose, really, which censors LGBTI content. So I'm going to begin with the Minister, I suppose, just to get your reaction to that. I mean, what can be done, I suppose, at an Irish level, at a European level, to oppose this legislation?
Thanks very much, and it's fantastic to be here at the Pride debate again. I suppose I'm lucky to have grown up at a time and in a country where my rights as a member of the LGBTI plus community has always gone in one direction, and that's gone forward, and that's been advanced. And coming from, I suppose, a country when in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was coming out, where things were, on the cusp of change, to 10 years later, or let's say 15 years later, where we were the world's first country to vote yes to marriage equality. And just the sense of being in a European country where your rights as a member of the LGBTI plus community are going backwards, it must be genuinely terrifying. And I don't know anyone else really who's had to experience your position in society being reversed. And that's why it's so important that Europe speaks out. It's so important that Ireland speaks out, following the statements by various Polish politicians, including senior members of the Polish government, and the trend towards introducing these so-called LGBTI plus free zones. I met with the Polish ambassador, and I spoke with her, and I went through in detail our concerns. And I suppose I spoke to her as Minister for Equality, but particularly also as Minister for Children, and just spoke to try and get the sense of what if you're a young person seeking to come out and you're hearing national figures say you're dirt, say you're undermining the fabric of the country. And subsequently, in terms of what's happening in Hungary right now, this conflation of child protection with anti-LGBTI initiatives. And it is homophobia masquerading as child protection. And I do think it's really important we call that out, and that trope has been deployed in many contexts over the years, but we're seeing it now in 2021 being deployed in an EU member state. And I think it is really important that the EU speaks with one voice in this. We haven't quite gotten one voice, but I think the reaction has been very strong, and certainly I know Simon Coveney has been extremely strong in his condemnation of what's happening. I suppose one thing I would say, I think some people have said, oh, Hungary, if Hungary don't like our rules, they should go out. I don't agree with that. I think I want to see countries in, because I think right now, if some of these countries leave, what protections are there for the LGBTI plus community? At least we can exert some weight, and I suppose we'll see how much weight we can, but I think it is really important that we're in a position to reach out to LGBTI plus people in these countries.
Minister, I'm actually going to relay your point there to our remote panellist, the MEP. Leisha, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. So we've had the Minister there, our own Irish Minister for Equality, and he has condemned what's happening in Hungary and Poland, in particular the recently passed Hungarian law. But he also makes the point that it's important to keep countries like Hungary within the European Union, because then there is some level of protection for the LGBT communities in those countries. Would you agree with that? And as Vice President of the LGBTI group, what's your reaction to Hungary and Poland developments?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for having me today. I fully agree with the Minister, because I believe that if they would leave the EU, then how would that benefit the LGBTIQ community in Hungary? And what is happening in Hungary is very tragic and actually outrageous, because, well, this law that was passed, I think that the Minister said it very well, it's homophobia hiding as child protection, and that's just it. I think that this is also not an isolated event. Obviously, the LGBTIQ rights in Hungary, Poland, but also other member states have really been deteriorating. And also when it comes to LGBTIQ rights, when there's no such thing as a standstill. Standstill means backsliding in that part of Europe right now, tragically so. So I believe that we should really fight with all the means that we have in the European Union. We have infringement procedures, Article 7 procedures, and not to get into much technical details, but I really think that we should take all these instruments and really make sure that in Hungary, everyone, no matter what color, no matter your gender, who you love should not matter in any way how you are accepted by society.
Well, that's very strong, and thank you for that statement. And you did mention, I suppose, that there are other procedures that can be brought against countries like Hungary and Poland who are actually in violation of not just European values, but the actual European treaties. And the European Commission, as you'll be aware, sent a very strong communique to the government in Budapest to say that on numerous grounds that this is actually violating European treaties. And of course, in Poland, we had, when there was financial support withdrawn from certain municipalities, we saw those LGBT freedom zones actually being rolled back and being repealed. So I suppose that is very important. I'll just explain for my panellists who are here with me in Dublin. The MEP there who's joining us has said that it is important that we try to our best to support the Hungarian and Polish minorities, and that we use Europe, basically. There is a benefit having them from within, because they get a certain amount of security from that as well. Senator Annie Hoey of the Labour Party here in Ireland, what's your reaction to developments in Hungary and Poland at the moment?
I think it's terribly sad, and I think, as the Minister said, it's the first time I've been aware of things going backwards, not forwards, and I think it really must be very frightening. I've spoken to some young activists in both of those countries who have an enormous amount of spirit and enthusiasm, but are very frightened, are very upset, are very frustrated, particularly when we were talking about, Ireland. We sing ourselves as a bastion. We had our marriage equality, and we push ourselves forward into the 21st century. And I suppose that's some of the work that I've been doing, and there's other activists, I'm sure, in Ireland who are doing that as well, trying to provide that solidarity with young activists, trying to offer support, and whatever it is that we can do to, I suppose, in a way, keep their spirits up, but also to show that there is that international global solidarity. I think I agree that I don't think necessarily want to push a country out, because we do need to protect the LGBTQI members, but I would hope that we see Europe really pushing on this, because, as you said, there's breaches of treaties, there's breaches of rights, and I think it's very important that is pushed as far as it can be pushed, and that it's not merely words but actions. I think that's important, yeah.
And the Taoiseach, actually, when I interviewed him last week as part of the Pride Leader series, he made the point that actually this did cross a line. So Hungary and Poland have, on whether it's an independent judiciary or whether it's rule of law, that they have now really been, I suppose, undermining European laws and values, but that this really takes it to a whole new level, because it's really attacking people. It's actually directly attacking communities. And as the Minister said very rightly, that the ultimate kind of slur really against LGBT, gay men in particular, I think, about how, conflating it with child protection, that really cannot be tolerated in any situation. But I just wonder, and whoever wants to come in this, maybe the Minister, does there have to be the ultimate threat of leaving the European Union, in the sense that any club that you join and you completely abuse the rules, there has to be an ultimate consequence to that? So would there be a danger of taking expulsion off the table entirely from the likes of Hungary and Poland?
Look, I think all and every sanction has to be available when core fundamental rights are being threatened. I suppose I was just maybe speaking more in the context of the comments of, I think it was the Dutch Prime Minister, who was kind of bringing us to 10 straight away. That being said, I don't think we can ignore the seriousness of what's happening in these countries, particularly in both countries. And I don't think we can ignore it as part of a pattern of targeting. You made the point about the institutional damage that's being done in those countries to try and preserve certain political values and copper fasten them within the judiciary or within the parliamentary system. But I think, we've seen, particularly in Hungary, the scapegoating of immigrants during the immigrant crisis in 2015. We've seen them target trade unionists. And even in Poland, we've seen the targeting and particularly a negative approach been taken to immigrants as well. So there is a persistent pattern here. Certainly, I being the nerd that I am, I keep an eye on opinion polls, and I'm hoping that, particularly in Poland, Law and Justice Party do seem to be losing significant support. They've been in government now for a long time, and I'm hoping that we'll see something good in the next general election. But it is alarming to see Fidesz in Hungary maintain almost 50% support, plus worse parties, and there are worse than Fidesz in Hungary, with very sizable support from the Hungarian people, and that's really worrying, and it reminds us of the kind of the really pervasive damage that a focus on nationalism can do. And in as much as we saw that kind of focus on real kind of crass nationalism in the United States was so successful there, it still holds purchase elsewhere in Europe, and was pleased to see the French results there over the last 2 weekends, where give us a little bit of hope there anyway.
Okay. Leisha, you're still with us. You can still hear the debate, can you?
Yes, I can.
Okay. And did you catch the Minister's words there?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Okay. And I suppose, what would be your view on, the need for actions and not just words? I know the Parliament has been quite critical of the Commission for not being strong enough in sanctioning the likes of Hungary and Poland.
Yes, and I could not agree with him, with the Minister more. It has been a long time. It has remained only words. There has not been an infringement procedure started yet, so I believe that should be the first step right now to just bring Hungary to the Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice, and make sure that they repeal this law. And the Minister also talked about my Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. He's also my party leader, and he expressed that in the end, we have to take all these steps. We should really make sure that we have all these measures, and but in the end, if Hungary does not abide to the treaties, to the rules, then the last resort. He really mentioned it as a last resort. Then perhaps there's no place in Hungary in our European Union, but I think we can all agree that that would be a last resort and least a favorable option on the table. I think when we talk about an Article 7 procedure, so some of the measures that we want to take, they require unanimity, and that's the problem with all these countries that are, helping each other. Poland that doesn't want to have Hungary, the procedure towards Hungary, and vice versa, and that is something that I believe that we should really see if the instruments that we have are effective. And and that's something that we want to work on in the European Parliament as well.
Okay. Now I'm going to bring in Andrew. We're going to go north to Northern Ireland. Andrew, I'm sure you're also very disturbed about what's happening at the moment in Hungary and Poland.
Yeah, I think what's happening in Hungary and Poland, and also let's remember what happened in Istanbul on Saturday as well, is absolutely abhorrent. Let's remember that where these human rights of LGBT citizens are being infringed is only a short plane ride away, but yet this is occurring. And I do feel that in the case of Hungary and Poland, the EU needs to be taking a very firm response. There could be a case made that such a firmer response should have been made in the years preceding this, because we also have to remember what the Speaker of the Hungarian National Assembly said in 2019, and I'm not going to repeat it here tonight because it was disgusting. So there has to be a very clear response, but it also does highlight why ourselves in Northern Ireland, United Kingdom, also need to lead in terms of upholding LGBT rights and the what we sign up to, because we need to show an example in relation to that, and that is of massive significance. And that also applies to judgments from the European Court of Human Rights, and why we also need to uphold those and show that LGBT rights are universal, and it shouldn't be a case where LGBT rights are a matter of debate. They're universal, and we should be coming to the situation here in 2021 where there's no debate on that anymore. We have to move to a situation where these are universal human rights.
Okay, okay. And of course, I suppose in Northern Ireland, like anywhere else, you've seen kind of the evolution of LGBT plus rights and maybe some pushback in some quarters. So you'd be very firm in that it's a human rights issue and it can't really be seen in any other terms.
Yes, and I will probably come on to this later tonight, but some of the responses to my tweets in relation to this would prove that there's still an issue here to tackle in Northern Ireland in terms of homophobia and prejudice. What I would say is Northern Ireland society has drastically changed. We're the societal views have moved on. There's still a need to tackle that prejudice and discrimination, and that's not just in society, but it's also in political leadership, and that is a responsibility upon us all.
Okay, okay, thank you. Well, we're going to move on now, I suppose, from the European dimension. I'm just going to ask finally our MEP, Alicia, can you just tell us very briefly, perhaps, any plans that the intergroup have or what steps you're taking maybe to I suppose, put pressure on the European institutions to stand up for European values?
Yeah, so we are having a plenary debate, not this week, but next week in Strasbourg, and then we're gonna talk to the Commission what instruments they have used so far, and we have a new instrument, rule of law mechanism, which is connected to the budget, and if we can do something with the budget to really put pressure on Hungary, and this is a really strong instrument. It has not been used so far, and this is something that we really hope that can be used against Hungary at this point.
Okay, well, I'm going to thank now my guest calling from Europe, and thank you for your contribution. Take care now.
Thank you for having me.
So now we're going to turn maybe to some domestic matters, some of the legislative priorities here in Ireland, and I'm going to ask the Minister maybe, we'll start perhaps with hate crime. And in my interviews with the main party leaders, they were all very firm in the belief that, first of all, we need to have a hate crime law. We're one of the few countries in the Western world who doesn't have one, but that it must be both effective and fully LGBTI inclusive, so that there's any attempt to water it down will be resisted. Would you, as Minister for Equality, would you concur with that, Roderick?
Absolutely, and I was delighted to see the commitment in the programme for government to bring in hate crime legislation and to do it swiftly. I think 18 months was that the legislation would be drafted. That was a key ask of my own party, and Minister McEntee has worked very quickly in terms of we now have the heads of bill bringing hate crime in as an aggravated offence, and I think that was always identified maybe as experts like Jennifer Schwepp down in UL as the best way to proceed. Obviously, and no doubt she and others will have views in terms of tweaking it from its initial draft. I think it's also important that the incitement legislation is being reviewed and being reshaped as well to make it more applicable, more usable, because I think we know it's been in there since 1989 and the number of prosecutions under it are extremely low. I think this is really important for the LGBTI plus community. It's also important for many other communities in Ireland as well, the black and mixed race community, the traveller community. Quite a significant number of people with disabilities have suffered hate-based crimes as well. So I think the model is good. I don't think there's any question of the government allowing for it to be its protection of LGBTI plus people to be watered down in any way, nor do I think there's any call for that across the Dáil. Well, the vast majority of the Dáil, I would say anyway. And I think it is a really positive fact that we'll have that legislation passed, hopefully by perhaps the middle of next year. But it's very necessary as well, and we have been too long without those protections, as you said, that are available in most other European countries.
And in terms of a timeline, would you be looking more to next year? I mean, the Taoiseach was hopeful it could be passed in the autumn session.
I'd love to see it passed in the autumn. Actually, today I'm one day in this job, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that everything takes longer than you would like. particularly with legislation. It'll go through pre-legislative scrutiny now in the Justice Committee, which I know is really, really busy and has a lot of bills for pre-legislative scrutiny. I think it's important it goes through that pre-legislative scrutiny process, because that gives different groups and academics the opportunity to input and look to maybe bring about improvements even before we go into the legislative session. So if we could get that finished in the autumn term, and maybe it brought into one of the houses there, and hopefully then get it fully passed by early next year. Obviously, there's other pieces we're doing as well that's linked to it, but I think that would be a realistic probably time frame. Just that's my experience.
And when I was speaking with the Taoiseach, he also talked about the online safety legislation that's kind of happening in parallel with the hate crime, because, and as you're very familiar with, and as other people in public life, I think women in particular, LGBT and people from minorities, really, I think, get very extreme abuse online, and it's just not acceptable. And I think the Taoiseach, for example, said that, and he agreed that self-regulation of the tech companies hasn't really worked in this area, and that there needs to be a stronger kind of legislative underpinning to make sure that when there is that level of hatred and that level of abuse and lies, basically, about people being spread, that there is effective remedy against that. So I'm sure the Labour Party is supporting both those pieces, the online and on safety and the hate crime.
And I'm on the media committee, so we're going through the pre-life scrutiny at the moment of the online safety, and we've been getting presentations from obviously the big tech companies, but also incredibly powerful presentations from students from secondary schools who've talked about their experiences online. We've had a really broad, it's an extraordinarily large piece of legislation. I can't believe my first time doing a piece of legislation. It's massive, and it covers so many areas, but it has been really striking, actually, the stories that have come out, particularly of young people and parents talking about their children's experiences online. That's really difficult to hear, and we simply have to do better. And there is an element of the onus is on ourselves as well to call out stuff online, but I don't think it's acceptable that that's the only way to do it. Ultimately, there are people behind some of these awful things online. Someone knows someone. Everyone knows someone. Someone has to know them. These anonymous people. But ultimately, I think the right thing to do is to have government support and opposition support, and we'll be certainly supporting both of these pieces of legislation. That it is not good enough anymore for pockets of self-regulation or just to wag fingers at people being like, just be nice online. We all know that's not going to work. And I think we really need this legislation.
Well, it's been called kind of the Wild West, hasn't it? Social media. Other traditional forms of media would be quite regulated, and in terms of what defamation and in terms of what you can print and all that. So I suppose why would the online world be any different? And if anything, they're as if not more influential now when it comes to influencing public opinion. So it's probably more the law catching up with technology, isn't it, than anything else. Andrew, I suppose from your vantage point in Northern Ireland, you have hate crime legislation in place. I mean, has it been effective in dealing with hate issues?
There has been legislation in place. Its effectiveness is probably difficult to measure because there's a vast underreporting of hate crimes and hate incidents. And I know that for myself, that I'm turning 45 next month, and so I've got an understanding of many things that probably happened in the past, probably should have been reported, but I didn't because of the perception that it wasn't unacceptable. But now, sitting here today, the view is it was clearly unacceptable and it was a crime. Also, the outcome rate is relatively low in terms of actually being able to secure prosecutions, and that's a whole issue in terms of being able to gather evidence around that. There was a review undertaken recently, and one of the recommendations out of that is for new legislation to come forward. The Justice Minister, who's also my party leader, Naomi Long, is committed to doing that. There's the Assembly only came back in January of last year, and then within 2 months we were propelled into a pandemic. So being able to progress legislation has been slightly inhibited, but the Minister is progressing probably one of the biggest packages of legislation at the present moment in time, and is committed to taking forward this reform in terms of hate crime legislation as within the next mandate, if we obviously get that ministry again. Also the issue in terms of online safety, the UK government is committed to a bill around that, but I would echo some of the comments around the need for personal responsibility around that. Last week, a number of ourselves within the LGBT community issued a statement in relation to governance around Belfast Pride, and then I was alerted by one of those out reps in terms of the comments which were made on Facebook, and it just highlighted the real need to tackle this. And I think we are coming to a stage here where, in terms of social media companies who are making quite significant profits, will have to take some elements in terms of user authentication around this, because the ability to be able to go on and post comments which are really totally unacceptable has to be tackled, because that has a massive impact not just upon the individuals but also upon the community.
And isn't it the case as well, Andrew, that any law needs to be backed up with resources? I mean, there's no point having a law that's merely symbolic. And I know the Minister, you referenced the 1989 Incitement to Hatred Act, probably a very well-intentioned piece of legislation, but as you said, it's proven to be very toothless and almost impossible to bring any kind of legal remedy under it, or give victims any kind of justice. So as you say, that's part of the review as well. So I'm sure you'd agree that there has to be effective as well as just having the law in place. Minister.
Absolutely, and I had a meeting with Commissioner Drew Harris and Deputy Commissioner Paula Hillman there 2 weeks ago. It was primarily just discussing issues to do with the relationship between An Garda Síochána and the black and mixed race community, both nationally and specifically in my own constituency of Dublin 15, where obviously we had the tragic killing of George and Jenna there at the start of the year. But one of the things that the Commissioner spoke about was that all Gardaí are currently undergoing mandatory training in terms of hate crime, and in terms of having a full understanding of the definitions around hate crime and the responsibilities of member of An Garda Síochána. And I think that is one thing that has been maybe reflected over the years from different communities, a sense that where incidents were taking place, they weren't being fully reported. And I think An Garda Síochána would accept themselves that a lot more could have been done there. So I was very pleased to see, even in advance of the new legislation coming in, that An Garda Síochána are acting proactively and undertaking this training module for all members of the force.
And also very welcome, I think, is that the Gardaí had their own definition of hate crime and hate incidents, even in the absence of legislation, which again is very victim-centred. It's the person who perceives that they were the victim of a hate crime or a hate incident that will be recorded and that will be followed up upon. And actually, Andrew, because I know again you can't hear Andrew, he has said that the underreporting is a big problem. And that's also in this jurisdiction. I'm sure it's everywhere, really. Hate crime is particularly underreported. So there's so much to be done around that. But before we move on from the topic, I would just say that in the NXF, we conducted the Burning Issues 2 research, and that did reveal that hate crime was the leading concern of the LGBT plus community. So it really is important. And even the Taoiseach, I think, said that he understood that there is a mandate, if you like, to progress this under the LGBT plus strand, because there is that, the research makes that very clear. I'm going to, I suppose, turn to another issue now, and that would be the whole conversion therapy, so-called conversion therapy, which really is a very abusive and discredited practice, but that still continues, unfortunately. And I'm going to start with Andrew, because there was a debate, wasn't there, Andrew, in Stormont, and a vote. It was about 6 weeks ago at this stage, and it was quite illuminating. Do you want to maybe, I suppose, fill in the Republic of Ireland audience maybe about how that debate went and the political fallout from it?
Yeah, I suppose there's two aspects from that, Adam. One, the fact that a number of DUP MLAs, by abstaining on the vote rather than voting against the motion which was calling for a ban on conversion therapy, that was one of the factors that is viewed as triggering the DUP drama and leadership crisis.
Yes.
Says quite a lot in terms of the state of that party, but also the fact that the Assembly was able, aside from that situation, to unite in calling for a ban on conversion therapy was a positive factor. But the most key thing now is for legislation, because we can debate motions and pass them, but we actually need legislation. And I am disappointed that it's looking increasingly unlikely that there will be a ban on conversion therapy within the rest of this mandate of the Assembly, because the time for legislation really to be brought through to get passed by the end of the mandate is now very likely past. There is a need for a ban, and I know the UK government have signalled that they're going to progress one. There would be potentially an opportunity then, if that legislation was seen to be worthy, to adopt that in Northern Ireland through a legislative consent motion. But thus far, we still haven't seen sight of that legislation. And a ban which doesn't have meaning or is not effective and has significant exclusions is not worthy. It is meaningless. It would need to have an effective ban. And some of the issues and some of the comments coming from the UK Prime Minister would have me concerned that what the nature of that ban will be, because this is a very harmful practice, and really we shouldn't be debating whether it's acceptable or not. We just need to move forward with effective legislation to ban it.
Well, I suppose there's two things there, Andrew, isn't there? I mean, first of all, and the Sinn Féin leader, actually, when I spoke to her, she said that the conversion therapy vote cost Arlene Foster her job. You know, that just by abstaining, that she upset many people in her party, that they wanted complete opposition to banning conversion therapy. And it should be said as well that there's been a North-South anti-conversion therapy coalition group formed, and they're doing really excellent work. And I think all parties, North and South, bar the DUP unfortunately, have actually endorsed their campaign. And the second thing, because Andrew just there talked about the review that's happening in Britain as well, they're having a consultation about banning conversion therapy. But a lot of people would say, why do you need to consult on banning a form of torture, what's called a form of torture by the United Nations? And there's also fears that they're kind of teeing things up, the Tory government in Britain, with allowing opt-outs on religious grounds. And of course, the vast majority of this so-called therapy happens in religious settings. And I know, Minister, you talked there, I think about a month ago in an interview with the Journal, where you said that not only do we need to ban this in itself because it's harmful, but that we need to send out the message that, I think I'm quoting you directly here, that sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression, people's characteristics, are not up for debate.
No, absolutely. And I think that is the clear message that we need to send out. I think that's the message reflected in the programme for government commitment to ban conversion therapy, so-called, and it's also reflected in the National LGBTI plus inclusion strategy as well. What I will say, though, is I think it is important that we do research, particularly in terms of where this is taking place right now. And we do that not to provide a justification for banning it, but to ensuring that our legislation, when we bring it forward, is designed and shaped in the best way that it can actually achieve the result. Because whether it is primarily taking place in that quasi-religious context, or is it taking place more in a professional context, is quite relevant in terms of what sort of legislation we bring forward. So that's why we are undertaking research work at the moment, and that research work is being done in conjunction with the LGBTI plus inclusion policy, the steering group, and there's a research subcommittee, and they're leading in terms of designing that, and that work will be going out to tender shortly. I think we're also looking to do a kind of a broader survey as well, so having a bit of the quantitative and the qualitative aspect of it as well. I've met with Senator Fintan Warfield a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed his own bill, and we discussed in terms of the government's next steps. I want to get this research back, and then I suppose I'll be in conjunction with the rest of the government making a determination as to whether we're going ahead with supporting Senator Warfield's bill, potentially with some amendments, or whether the government will be bringing forward its own piece of legislation. I'm entirely open at this point. The legislative power here is actually primarily with the Minister for Health, but I suppose in terms of the Department of Equality, we're working to support the Department of Health in terms of bringing together that piece of research. And I had the opportunity to meet with that coalition group recently. They're a really, really good group. We kind of discussed various issues, and one of the things I was saying is I'm hoping to meet more people myself, maybe, who've undergone conversion therapy, just to learn from their own experiences. I met with someone recently, and it was really impactful. And I think, again, in so much of how we've seen LGBTI plus rights advance in this country, a lot of the time it is that personal story to bring it away from some abstract concept. Oh, I've never heard of conversion therapy, it mustn't be happening to. Well, actually it is happening.
Yeah.
It's not to a huge number of people, but it is happening, and it's having an incredibly negative impact on their lives, particularly when they're young people. And I think that will really strengthen the case, if it needed strengthening, that we need to ban this
But I
practice in
suppose,
law.
to be clear, Minister, you're not going to be consulting on whether there should be a ban, or whether, that as long as it's under the guise of prayer, it's acceptable. I mean, I presume your kind of research into the topic is to make it as comprehensive and as effective as possible.
The reasoning behind the research is to understand the context in which conversion therapy is currently taking place, so we can design the legislation most effectively to deal with it.
Okay, and actually, just before I bring in Annie Hoey, the NXF actually worked with Senator Warfield back in 2018 around that bill, and it really is an excellent piece of legislation. So hopefully we can advance that, and we can see that. But you'd certainly be keen. I mean, you'd agree, I'm sure, Annie, that that needs to happen during this term of government.
Oh, absolutely, and we were co-signatories on that piece of legislation. Vanna Bacik co-signed it with Fintan Warfield, so we are very, very much obviously in favour, but we want to see it happening soon. It seems to be such a bizarre thing that we're actually even having a conversation about banning conversion therapy. Like, it seems kind of crazy that it's happening in the 21st century, and obviously it is happening. It's extraordinarily traumatic, it's very, very difficult. And I think people sometimes forget, this thing, why do we still have Pride? Why are we still marching? Why do you do all these things? It's like, well, because there are people who are currently trying to be talked out of being gay. There are people who are going under, as you said, torture to try and get them to not be who they are because of their gender identity, because of their sexual orientation. So we really, really, and we are very keen to work with yourself and whoever it is to get this particular piece of legislation over the line, either your legislation or, as you said, the legislation that's being written, because it's just such unfathomable. I think a lot of people wouldn't even believe that we're having this conversation.
Yeah. But I mean, I think Andrew, would attest that it's happening in Northern Ireland. It's happening. Mary McAleese has talked about it happening in the south. And also, the Taoiseach actually talked about how maybe some kind of religious movements, that are in Ireland, that they're now doing it. That it's kind of it's under all kind of, whether they're evangelical, whether they're Catholic, whether they're non-Christian. It has to be across the board. It does have to be across the board, Minister, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that's why that piece of research is really important, because there's no point in designing the legislation with a kind of an assumption that conversion therapy is working in one sphere and finding it works somewhere else. I think the cross-border element that you spoke to is really important as well. And I know there are actions, and perhaps Andrew will speak more on those in terms of, I think, within the executive taking place, but obviously we saw the failure of the piece of legislation to get through the Assembly, which was deeply disappointing. I think there will be much stronger support, and Annie's spoken to that already, and the cross-party coalition group speaks to that there is much stronger support in Ireland to get this legislation done, and as I say, we're absolutely committed to doing it. Since Senator Warfield's bill was originally in the Shannon in the last session, it doesn't seem to have advanced very far in terms of the last session of the Dáil and Shannon, and that's why we're pushing it hard in terms of bringing forward that research initially and using that then to inform the next steps the government take towards banning it in legislation.
Okay. And Andrew, we'll be following developments closely as well in Northern Ireland about how this issue advances, considering that it was kind of so explosive in the debate in Stormont. But it should be said as well that, the majority of MLAs did vote for the comprehensive ban, didn't they, Andrew?
They did indeed. And I think the issue for me is that a significant concern around conversion therapy would be that it occurs in a faith-based setting. So that to have a blanket exclusion around that would mean that the ban wouldn't have the effect that it needs to have. From my perspective, a straw man argument is being built that a ban on conversion therapy would be an attack upon religious freedom. That straw man was built around equal marriage, and we were all warned that the sky would fall in when that was introduced. And do you know something, Adam? What just happened after that was people were a bit more equal and a bit more happy
Yes.
and a bit more of valued citizens. And the same is the case in relation to this conversion therapy, because any ban on conversion therapy would have to be compliant with the European Convention of Human Rights, and that's a fact in reality in terms of all legislation that's passed by the Assembly and also in Westminster. So we do need to move forward with this, and it needs to be an effective ban.
And of course, as well, just being in compliance with human rights legislation, because Andrew there is saying that any legislation, of course, has to be in compliance with the European Court of Human Rights. But the UN Rapporteur for Religious Freedom, he's been very clear on this. He spoke in the House of Commons before a parliamentary committee, and he made very clear that freedom of religion doesn't mean that you have the freedom to harm other people. And he was saying that that absolutely should be taken off the table, actually, that in somehow that there's a balance to be struck between religious freedom and between conversion therapy. That's kind of a non-starter where this issue is concerned. Andrew, actually, just staying in Northern Ireland very briefly, your rules around blood donation changed. Did they in line with England and Wales quite recently? Is it now 3-month deferral?
Yeah, they did, but that being brought into effect, there's been a delay upon that, and that's been cited as a result of a resourcing and an operational issue within the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service. I would say that there's a particular role upon political leaders in terms of the discourse around these issues to show leadership and inclusive leadership. And the previous leader of the DUP failed in that regard in relation to blood donation, and that's something that I bitterly regret, and I think needs to be called out.
Okay, and in the South, actually, Minister, in terms of blood donation, since 2017 there's been a 1-year deferral, and that was they repealed the lifetime ban. But now a lot of other countries have moved further, keeping up with the science, that it shouldn't be based on gender or sexual orientation. And in Britain now, for example, it's become completely blind to heterosexual or homosexual. It's more about your own behaviour. Isn't Ireland at risk of falling behind on this, and perpetrating, I suppose, a stigma that's no longer right or appropriate?
Well, I think, as you said, it's really important that we keep up with the science. And I suppose that's been our mantra over the last 15 months in terms of our response to COVID, and it should be our mantra in terms of all public health decisions that we take. And as you've seen, we have taken in, I suppose, important public health decisions, I suppose, over the last 2 years in terms of availability of PrEP and the like. And I think it is important that rules in terms of blood and blood products do reflect the most up-to-date science.
Because definitely the vast majority of other European countries, it's a 3-month deferral. So Ireland having a 1-year ban is now actually quite out of sync with where most other European countries are. And I suppose it does send out a message, a very harmful message, that about kind of, the health of kind of gay, bi and MSM, So would that ultimately be a decision of government or the IBTS to review that? Is there any plans to review that?
I think it's addressed within the context of the LGBTI plus inclusion strategy. I think it's one of the action points there in terms of the the health actions. And look, I chair the steering committee. We actually had a meeting only last week. So look, that's certainly, I think, a forum where we can look to ensure that we have the most, I suppose, up-to-date public health guidance in terms of how we set rules in terms of the ability to donate blood.
Okay. And Annie, in a former guise, when you were in the president of the USI, this was a big issue for them, wasn't it? Campaigning to end the discriminatory rules around blood donation.
Yeah, and it's as we said, we need to keep up with the science on this. We have a situation where I know people give blood in other countries because they can't give blood here. And that's giving blood is extremely important. We need more people to do it. And it certainly became an issue, I think, that a lot of young LGBTQIA people became very impassioned about. There was, campaigns across campuses, and there was a lot of movement on this over the past couple of years because I think it was so deeply and felt this injustice. They're like, why are we being treated any differently? It's a very old-fashioned, I think, linking sometimes this, promiscuity and this whole thing of being dangerous and not being able to be trusted and all of these things. And that's not something that a lot of, I think, young LGBTQ people have experienced as part of their narrative, don't see that as within the wider sphere as something that they are associated with. You know, it's a younger generation of LGBTQIA people, and I think they're very resistant to this, and I think they would very much welcome us getting in line with other countries, and for them to be not treated as other. And you know, we have a very politically activist group of LGBTQIA people of all ages, actually, not particularly young people who've been mobilised over the past few years around things like marriage equality. And it's a deep frustration that there's this kind of, I would say, old-fashioned idea maybe floating around blood donation and the kind of person that you are.
Well, it's a hangover from the 1980s, you know, and what was happening then, and you know, thankfully how far we've evolved, or how far we've come since then. But it has to be said that all those countries that have moved to relax their blood donation policies, there has been no negative fallout from a health point of view. So, you know, that really does need to be stressed. So that's something that we'll watch to see will that policy change. I'm now just going to turn to, I suppose, another important issue, and that's the whole area of education equality. And the curriculum minister is currently subject to review, isn't it? And I suppose in tandem with that, we had a report in 2019 from the All-Party Oireachtas Education Committee, and that did call for legislative change to the 1998 Education Act, which kind of allows a broad opt-out for schools under ethos grounds. I mean, isn't it only right now that our state-funded, state-maintained schools would have an updated modern curriculum that would be consent, you talk about consent, talk about all those important issues, online safety, which didn't really exist in 1998, but also that it would be fully LGBT inclusive.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there have been changes in the curriculum, and particularly in terms of how RSE is taught at second level, and also in terms of well-being at primary level, particularly the introduction of the new child protection guidelines in 2017. I sat on the board of management of a primary school, and the introduction of those removed a lot of discretion for schools in terms of being ensuring that they had to teach kind of common anatomical terms to children, including children in primary schools, so they would be in the position, if there was some allegation of sexual abuse, that they could properly describe what happened to them. So I think that was an important first step from a child protection point of view. But I think the wider importance of ensuring that LGBTI people, and particularly families, are reflected in the curriculum are really important. And I know in terms of my role as Children's Minister, every so often I'm at book launches and get to see some beautiful books that are out there now in terms of really nice kind of stories for children, in terms of identifying the diversity of families that we have here in Ireland these days. So I think absolutely, yeah, that's something that needs to be progressed. Again, I know it's also an action under the LGBTI plus inclusion strategy, and I know it's something that Minister Norma Foley is working on. I think what you said also in terms of state-funded schools and the chilling effect that requirement in terms of the ability to discriminate on ethos grounds has, particularly for, I think, LGBTI plus teachers. And I've spoken to teachers who've experienced that, or maybe without even experiencing it, just are a bit cautious and just feel they can't quite be themselves. Maybe they can't introduce their partner to the principal or the board of management for a couple of years at least, until they're well bedded into a place. And that's not right. And 2 weeks ago, I announced a review of the equality legislation in this country, the Equal Status Act and the Employment Equality Act. And those are two pieces of legislation that have been around just over 20 years now. They've served us very well, but I think it is an opportunity to review. We're looking at it in the first instance, looking at the gender ground and ensuring that trans and intersex people are properly protected under the gender ground. We're also looking at the introduction of discrimination on the grounds of socioeconomic status, and having that as a new 10th separate ground, which I think would be quite groundbreaking. But we're also looking at the wider operation of those pieces of legislation, and I think that perhaps is a real opportunity for us to consider whether we want to continue that ethos-based exclusion.
Minister, what's the timeline for that review?
The timeline is we're going to put out to consultation in the next number of weeks, and we would be looking to bring proposals to Cabinet probably in 2022.
Okay. And Annie, just on the education equality piece, I mean, I'm sure you would endorse what that all-party Oireachtas committee said, that there should be mandatory, standardised curriculum. The Taoiseach, the Taoiseach and the Sinn Féin leader all agreed with that why should RSC be taught any differently to mathematics or English or any other part of the curriculum? You'd agree with that?
No, of course, absolutely. And I think it's really important to think of, not just LGBTQIA children in our schools, but also children of LGBTQIA families. And they don't see their families reflected. I mean, we have to move away from this kind of homogenous idea of a very particular kind of family. And that actually includes not just children of LGBTQIA, there are children of, lone parents and all sorts of different kinds of families. And I think it's very important that in Ireland we start to reflect that from a very young age. Otherwise we consistently create otherness, we embed difference into people from a very young age, and that continues all through people's lives. Like all of us, I'm sure, can remember feeling different and knowing that we were different, and having no one around us talking about that, or not being able to see us or how we were thinking or feeling reflected anywhere, either in our books or in our role models. And I think it's so important that Ireland, as we constantly say, we're progressing forward, we're moving forward, that those children are included, and their family structures and their home structures of whatever form they are, not just LGBTQIA, are reflected in our curriculum, in our books, in our learning, in how they are spoken about in schools. I think that's really, really important.
Well, I think you've touched on something there, Annie, is, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And that's why role models do matter. Sometimes you hear, both terms like identity politics or tokenism, as if somehow people would only get to those positions because they're minorities, not understanding that actually that sends out a very powerful message, that people, they get to a place, and that visibility encourages others, encourages other people to think, well, I could do that, or I could actually aspire to be that. So I think you've kind of tapped into something. I think it was actually the Taoiseach mentioned that. So now, I suppose, in the final stage of our debate, I'm going to maybe just turn it to a more personal dimension. We're all members of the LGBT plus community here, and I just want to and I'm going to start with Andrew, joining us from Northern Ireland. Andrew, how important do you think it is to be having that visibility and your own visibility in politics?
I think it's very important that politics represents society, and I know from contact I've had with constituents and people I know, that for myself being an out public representative, the positive impact that that's had upon them around that. I do think that society has changed, and has changed very drastically, particularly in just recent years. So I can remember the types of maybe responses I would have got a few years ago compared to today. So in some ways I think that politics is now ahead of some of the politicians in Northern Ireland, and that's reflecting itself in some of the discourse that's happening around that, and I think that's really positive, and I think if we can show leadership around these issues, we can act as a beacon of hope for other countries, which we talked about particularly at the beginning of tonight's debate.
Okay, so Andrew has just said there that we can act as a beacon of hope. Maybe if you have, if you're visible, if you can be in politics and you can be LGBT plus, and that doesn't hold you back, then maybe countries where there's a lot of persecution, they can maybe one day hope that their countries might reach that. I mean, Roderick, you've been out as in politics since you were a councillor, haven't you? You've never, I suppose, hidden your identity or anything like that. And I mean, I'm sure you believe that's important. Was there ever any doubt in your mind about being afraid to be out in case it had any electoral kind of consequences for you?
I remember the first time I went for selection in 2004 for a nomination for the Green Party, to be the Green Party candidate in the Castleknock ward in the local elections that year. And I remember saying it at the selection convention to the members, be like, I'm just putting this on record, that could be an issue. Because in 2004, it kind of was still an issue. Like, there were no, Senator Norris was the only, I think, openly gay, certainly member of the Oireachtas at that stage. It would be a number of years before we had an openly gay member elected to the Oireachtas. So I did say it, and obviously within the party there were no issues. I have to say I've been very lucky in my life in that until I suppose around this time last year, I'd never really encountered any significant homophobic abuse, and that I suppose is just reflection of I suppose my own circumstances. I know lots of people didn't have that same experience growing up. I didn't come out till I was in college, and I had a group of friends in a university where everyone was very accepting. I do remember, I think it was probably the 2007 general election, somebody looking at my manifesto, which included the commitment on marriage equality, and someone saying, "Oh, I don't agree with that now. I can't believe the Greens are supportive of that." And I remember saying, "Well, as someone who's gay myself, I think that's something that's really important to me." And I do remember she looked at me and kind of put the leaflet down, and I remember she said, "Well, at least you admit it." She kind of spat that out, and I remember being kind of like, well, I'm glad I said it, because I think it was important that I didn't kind of let the comment slide. But I do remember I just remember the look of real disdain in her face, and be like, well, we have a way to go yet.
And I think the referendum, that's why it was so affirming. That this oft-quoted kind of Middle Ireland being very conservative, and I think until and during actually the 2015 referendum, a lot of people were afraid that in the privacy of the polling stations we'd see maybe a kind of a reactionary element of Ireland, but it was the opposite. The country voted overwhelmingly, and I think that just sent out the message that they were that kind of homophobia, where it's very harmful and very hurtful, it's now a minority. It's now a very small minority, but perhaps it's become more entrenched because of that, conversely, which is why then we need to have our legislation keeping up to pace with that. And your own, being an openly bi woman, your experience in politics, how important for you has it been to be, I suppose, your authentic self in politics?
I think I'm the second only out woman ever elected in there. I've obviously Catherine Zappone before me, so I think that's really important. As far as I'm aware, I'm the only out bisexual person who's been elected to our parliament, and I think that's important for that representation. It's a part of the community that's been pushed aside for a long time. I was doing a talk for Princeton. I don't know if you heard, I once did a talk for Princeton actually.
Big honour.
The person doing, he's like, you're really, like, you push it out a lot online that you're bisexual, that you're a member of the community, and someone edited my Wikipedia page and put in, she's bisexual, like Annie Hoey's bisexual, like, and I didn't do it, someone else did it. But I think it is important. And I get a lot of young people messaging me on Instagram or sending me DMs on Twitter being like, I really appreciate how out you are. I appreciate that you consistently push that. It's not the only part of my identity, but I'm extremely aware that is a deeply underrepresented identity, and we needn't get into our lack of representation in a whole other set of areas. But I'm very acutely aware of that. And that I think there's only 7 or 9 out bisexual parliamentarians in the world right now. Right. We are a small group of people.
The B does often tend to be overlooked, doesn't it? I mean, you are right when you say that.
Yeah, and I think it's just, and if I do nothing else in my entire political career, to have those young people saying, I'm so glad that you are out, and I'm so glad that I can see you just talking about normal political things, but knowing that you are one of our community. Yeah. And they very often then end up talking to me about politics. I don't necessarily hold them into my own party, and I've spoken to them about other parties as well. But I think that's really important for people to see someone like them and to say, actually, I am not the only bisexual in the world. I'm not the only person. That there are lots of other people. I think particularly for young people for whom, gender and identity is certainly a much more fluid space to be in than even when I was younger. I think, and I have no intention actually of not talking about it anymore. And sometimes people comment being like, no one cares. And I'm like, actually, 15-year-old me cares. Yeah. I really care that I can be out, I can be proud, I can have bi pride, and that there are young people and older people looking at me and saying, she's just living her life, she's doing her thing, she's putting out kick-ass policies, she's speaking on really important things, and she's also living her truth out loud. And I don't care how frustrating that is for people. I will continue flying that flag until the day I am yeeted out of politics, and then I will keep flying it.
Good. And you know what, even in our own research, the NXF research, that was one of the top 10 issues, seeing people in public life, seeing openly LGBT plus people in public life. And I think, Roderick, when you became a cabinet minister, again, I think you were maybe the second or third after Catherine and the Leo Varadkar. It's still a groundbreaking thing. I mean, you're right to say it's not the only part of your identity, but it's an important part of who we are, and a group that's underrepresented in politics, whether they're women, whether they're LGBT+, ethnic minorities, that visibility piece, I think. So, and to get to the level of cabinet is a real honour for anyone, but it's an extra element, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it is hugely important, and I suppose particularly at a time where we see, as we spoke about at the earlier part of the debate, senior politicians across Europe denigrating our community. I think it is important to see here in Ireland we have politicians who are LGBTI+, who are able to, you know, serve in the cabinet, who are able to become the leader of our country in terms of Leo. And you know, it does say something very significant about the country, about where Irish people are at the moment, and it does make a difference to young people. And I do know that myself from my own engagement, even between locally in Dublin West, and since becoming a minister, it does. And there is a real responsibility there, particularly in terms of the opportunity I have now to advance the equality for the LGBTI+ community, but wider issues of equality as well, because I suppose I came to politics from very much that green and environmental element, but I was lucky to find a party, and I'm sure Annie would say the same for her own, that really embraced that idea of equality and treating everyone the same. And I'm very conscious that I have an opportunity to do that now in the role. And as I say, we've in terms of the civil service, the equality unit moved over from the Department of Justice, and we're delighted to have them. It's a small unit. I'm hoping to beef it up, but we have so many things happening there in terms of what we've spoken about earlier on as regards conversion therapy, in terms of the national anti-racism strategy, in terms of paid leave for victims of domestic violence. There's a lot happening in the equality space at the moment. I'm really excited to have that opportunity.
And you know, there's so much more we could have covered. I mean, I'm conscious transgender rights. Yeah. The Taoiseach, for example, told me that he very much would support recognising non-binary, intersex as part of the gender recognition review. Many other issues we could have covered, but again, I suppose we're time limited in that sense. Can I thank my panellists, the Minister, Roderick O'Gorman, Senator Annie Hoey, and Andrew Moore, MLA, joining us from Northern Ireland. And we want to wish everyone a very happy Pride Month. You can watch this interview, or you can watch this debate on Dublin Pride social media channels, and it will also be shared by GCN and ourselves and the NXF, the National LGBT Federation. And there's also the Leaders interview series, where, as I said, I interviewed the Taoiseach and the would-be Taoiseach, and again, they're all available on social media. So thank you again to all, and happy Pride. Thank you.